A very good evening on behalf of the Bangalore Literature Festival and the Bangalore International Center. A very warm welcome. We are coming to you live from the Bangalore International Center in the first of our hybrid events for 2021, and we hope this is the first of many for this year. Today, we bring to you We Failed the Poor, India's Response to the Pandemic, with Harsh Mander, Pamela Philipose, Aakar Patel in conversation with Natasha Badhwar. With the pandemic-driven lockdown in March 2020, India plunged into its biggest humanitarian crisis since the partition. In his new book, Locking Down the Poor, author Harsh Mander tells us how grave this crisis was and continues to be. The book brings to us voices from out of work, daily wage, and informal workers, the homeless, the destitute, all overwhelmed by hunger and dread. Harsh is a human rights and peace worker, writer, columnist, researcher, teacher, and he works with survivors of mass violence, hunger, homeless persons, and street children. Join the conversation is Pamela Philipose, presently the public editor of the Wire.in, and she was earlier editor in chief of the Women's Feature Service and senior associate editor of the Indian Express. Her most recent book is Media's Shifting Terrain, which was published by Orient Black Swan. Joining us here at the Bangalore International Center is Aakar Patel. Aakar is a columnist and a BIC member. And bringing out their views this evening is Natasha Badhwar. Natasha is an author, columnist, filmmaker, and journalist. Her books include My Daughter's Mum and Immortal for a Moment. With that, we welcome you all, and Natasha, over to you.
Thank you. I'll be handing over soon to Aakar Patel, who is moderating this conversation. But I'm going to start the evening with playing a short video. It seems almost dystopian to be doing creative work at the same time as last year's pandemic months and lockdown months, when we were also going through what would have been for most of us months of helplessness, of shock, of rage, of not only being locked down in the way that we were, and Harsh will talk more about it, but also immediately discovering all around us that there were a majority of people, starting with the poorest and then quickly moving on to the working poor and finally even the middle classes, where people systematically lost their jobs, lost their sources of income, lost their ability to buy food and be able to feed themselves or their families. I've been working and collaborating with Harsh very closely for a while now. And when the lockdown was announced, within 2 days of it, Harsh and members of the Karwan-e-mohabbat media team, along with social workers and many volunteers, went out into the streets to meet the people who had been left stranded without jobs, without homes, and without any access to food. And we began to document, besides the large scale solidarity feeding project that was started almost impromptu and which was supported by on a global level by people who sent funds, by volunteers who came and joined hands throughout the country. But we also simultaneously began to document it on video, edit short films overnight, put them on the internet so that the story was told almost immediately. There was very few other people from broadcast media in the initial weeks of the lockdown because it was really strict. And we found ourselves as one of the very few people who were able to reach out at the risk of infection, at the risk of being beaten back by the police in many places. A large group of volunteers and people continued to reach out in solidarity. What we witnessed was mass hunger. There was helplessness, there was rage, there was shock, And from that is born the book that we are going to talk about tonight. From that are born some of the videos, are created some of the videos that we will share with you. These bring forward the voices of the people who were directly hit by the lockdown that was announced, very, very suddenly, and with no regard for what would happen to people when they were deprived of jobs and the ability to continue to stay on in the cities where they were working as migrant labor. With this, I'm going to request for the first video to be played.
I believe that when the history of our times is written, the history of humankind is written, we will be seen as among the most cruel periods in human history, the total breakdown of solidarity. There are large numbers of people, firstly, who don't even have homes. Where will they stay during this period? How will they lock themselves down? If 10 people are sharing, say, a small one-room set, and 150 people share one toilet, how are they ever going to social distance? The Prime Minister didn't seem to be concerned about that. He said everyone should keep washing their hands. Does he not know you just have to go out every morning and see outside slums 10 rupees, 20 rupees to get these 2 or 3 pots of water? Everything they have done has shown that some lives are valuable and must be protected, and some lives, a much larger number of lives, are entirely dispensable. The government will take no responsibility for them. The migrants, finally, when they had nothing at all, they began to walk. And please remember, this is the biggest distress movement of populations in human history, except for the slaves being taken from Africa. I mean, that I've calculated was larger. But it was even bigger than partition. This should have shaken us to our core. And it happened because 9 out of 10 workers have no protection of any kind.
Okay, the book is called Locking Down the Poor. It's about 200 pages. It has a dozen chapters. I recommend it strongly. It has 3 sort of components to it. It has the experiences that Harsh Mander and his team lived through. It has a compilation of media and research reports that give us data, and then it has reflections from him on how he found those days. Let me start by asking him to speak about the moment when he and his team went into this, why they felt the need to do so, and what it is that they found in the first few days.
See, Aakar, as I said also in this video, when the Prime Minister started speaking about a total lockdown, and he was telling us to stay at home and keep social distance and wash our hands, etc., and work from home, I was stunned. I was saying that, has he forgotten that the large majority of Indians don't have homes at all in cities, or have homes where 10 people live together? There's no question of any kind of social distance. That 9 out of 10 workers in the informal sector, every day they don't work, they won't earn, they won't be able to eat. So it was, and washing hands was, as I said, was out of the question when you don't have running water. So he was really addressing people like you and me. And most of all, right through, what has got exposed is that We're a country in which some lives matter, some lives have to be protected, the others we don't care. And the enormous support of the middle class for all of these actions, the lack of any kind of outrage. Anyway, so uh, as he was speaking, I work with the homeless, and I know that literally they eat what they earn every single day in very exploitative. They gather in labor addas, they picked up. And their only social security is actually the Gurdwara or the Dargah. And those have also shut down. So the devastation on their lives was almost immediate. So by the second or third day, I decided, and a lot of my young colleagues whom I admire greatly, because everyone was really frightened at that time about the virus, they decided that come what may, we will be on the streets. And we landed up at places where, there's a labor adda at Chandni Chowk, where 1,000 homeless people gathered, there were 5,000. There's a place called Yamuna Pushta. We saw 10,000 people had gathered. And, social distance, the question arises, there was just the rumor that somebody was disputing food, they'd fall over each other, and we reduced, and and we hadn't, we did it as an act of solidarity. I mean, it was if we call them our brothers and sisters, our homeless brothers and sisters, we need to be there. And I recall one of my young colleagues, I told him, are you not frightened of Corona? And he said something very beautiful. He said, Corona ka to dar hai, लेकिन मेरे डर से बहुत बड़ा है उनकी भूख, and therefore I have to be there. And so every day, and this young filmmaker Sandeep said, I will also have to be there for telling the stories. I turned reporter. We distribute food, then I talk about what I saw. It's the I see hunger in the countryside. We have seen, and we've seen. I've been a district collector. I've seen this kind of mass hunger from time to time. Droughts have happened. But in the city, you've never seen mass hunger of this scale. And it has been created by public policy. Because the reason you come to the city is that, John Robinson somewhere said that if there's anything worse than being exploited, it's not being exploited. In the city, in the village, you don't have work. You can't be exploited a lot of the time. In the city, as long as you're willing to do the lowest end work in the most exploitative terms, you will never be hungry. You can pick rags, no one will stop you. You can sell your body, you can go to labor, does the kind of work that they do. So except for people who severely mentally ill, people who completely at the edge, you don't see actual raw hunger of the kind that I saw in the countryside. And suddenly there was this explosion of hunger in the cities. And, we became like a distress call center. People started calling us. And the distress calls very quickly moved from just the homeless to industrial factory areas. Small units had all closed down. They were people who had fully functional lives. They were exploited, but they had fully functional lives. They had homes, they were paying rent, they were sending their children to school. They had regular work. And suddenly all of that went down. And our van would arrive, and in a minute you'd see a kilometer-long line. And people would say that this set of people said, we've never in our lives had to put our hands out like this for food. What did we think we were doing? What did the state think it was doing by creating, you shut down the economy, you shut down all demand and all supply. And then when people start saying, what will people do? So the Prime Minister then appeals to employers to pay them wages, and appeals to landlords not to ask. I mean, those appeals were meaningless. A large segment of the tiny and small sector anyway is owned by people who don't have the resources. They're almost as poor as the workers who are there. And in any case, it's not their fault that the economy was locked down. It was the government's decision. And like most of us in the middle class were paid wages, salaries for the period. the most elementary thing the government should have done if it went in for a lockdown of this scale. It's the largest lockdown in human history. It's the largest on the planet. And it had the smallest relief package of less than 1% of GDP. If they, we can debate, and I've argued in the book why the lockdown didn't make sense, even if, if the government had made provisions. But like the middle class, if the government decided, at least it should have said that everyone will get the equivalent of minimum wages, which is about 6,000 rupees a month. And we said that if you get that, plus your PDS rations, a double quota, Prabhat Patnaik, Jyoti Ghosh and I wrote a couple of opinion pieces where we calculated that it would have cost about 3% of the GDP.
We'll come to that. You write that, and I didn't know this, that a lot of the poor in our cities spend up to a fifth of what they earn on water every day.
Yes.
This would be the visuals we just saw of people lining up with pots and pans.
And desperate. And then you're telling them, wash your hands regularly.
This is under normal circumstances.
Under normal circumstances. And you're telling them to wash their hands regularly. I mean, we went to many places where people said, I mean, water is out of the question. You go to a Sulabh Sauchalaya, you have to pay 10 to 15 rupees to have a bath. We're talking about a reality that seems to have completely escaped our state and our middle classes.
Could you also describe to us what the lives of these poor in the cities are like? You spend a lot of time in the book on that. Many of us might not have had access to the kind of homes that they live in, or the sort of shanties that that their neighborhoods are composed of. What were their days and nights like during all these weeks of the lockdown?
They were desperate. I mean, they were desperate in multiple ways. Firstly, there was this talk about this, ailment, this infection, which had seemed to have brought the whole world on its knees. And there was the fear of that. But very many people from the first day when we went out with food, I kept hearing people saying, Corona se to hum baad mein marenge, pehle hum bhook se marenge. I recall this person who when he was in a line and suddenly he started shaking and firstly with anger, and he said everything is addressed to Modi ji. So he said, Modi ji कहते हैं कि हम घर में रहें, तो क्या हम दीवार तोड़ के खाएं? And should we just break the walls and eat it? And by the time his turn came, he was in tears, and he had to put out his hand, and he got one plop of khichdi. People said that, I met many people who said that actually we used to earn money by making rotis. हम लोग कारीगर थे, हम रोटी बनाते थे, और आज हम तरस रहे हैं, we're standing in line. And then the government, finally, when it was moved a little bit to provide for something, it was the most undignified format where people would literally 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers. So you wake up in the morning and have to sit in a long line in the heat, waiting for one plop of food.
You were part of the state, and you've been a civil servant, IS officer. I first heard you in 2002 when you said something that I didn't know, once again, that it was the infrastructure of the state. It was designed to stop a riot within 48 hours, I think.
No, 24 hours.
Within 24 hours.
The biggest.
Okay. So what is it that the state could have done here to have made sure that the problems of the poor were mitigated?
See, even if I was, 20 years ago in a small district town, I would still have been able to summon the resources that are required. I mean, in a city like Delhi, you had closed down all colleges, universities, you had stadiums. You could have provided, and what we learned very quickly was that people should not have to stand in line for cooked food. Why can't you just make a ration kit? So we then designed a ration kit, family of 5 for 10 days, 15 days, and we'd go. It was much more dignified. It had oil, it had salt, it had all the basic things, and soap, and people would take that. The dignity was more. I mean, I firstly, the lockdown didn't make sense in a country like ours, where even if it in its best, lot of people said it was badly implemented. My point is that when you know that the large majority of people in this country don't have homes in which they can live and keep social distance, where they don't have jobs which will pay them even a single day when they don't work, when they don't have any social security, they don't have access, they don't have documents, our health infrastructure is completely privatized. In these circumstances, even the best implemented lockdown would not have made sense. And please remember that there were just 500 recorded cases at the time the lockdown happened
per day.
per day. Our trains had the capacity at that time of carrying 23 million people every day. Instead, if they had just allowed, firstly, if they had said, we will give minimum wages to everybody, it's not the employer's responsibility. And informal workers, only about 15% have a recognized employer. So the Prime Minister was appealing only to that 15%. He forgot about the remaining 85%. You cannot be expected to live on the chance charity of an employer. So it is the state's responsibility. The state should have provided the minimum wages. It should have assured people with ration kit for the period of the lockdown. It should have also given people the opportunity to return to their homes. If you and I are stranded in a city which is not our own, and you're threatened with both hunger, joblessness, and the fact that this disease which the whole world seems to be collapsing under, where would you want to be? You'd want to be among the people who you love
and
and
you trust.
and so on. So, and one other thing, when these people have gone back, places like Bihar, rural UP,
I'll come to that later. Pamela Philipose, could you speak to why it is that the story didn't become as big as it should have, or did it actually become as big and most of us didn't care?
I think the importance of Harsh's account was he was there at ground zero from the 0 hour. And the point is, it is precisely because of initiatives of Harsh and others like him, very few, but there was a few who came out, that the media was also persuaded to actually tell the story. And it disturbed the government to such an extent that we had the Solicitor General going to court to tell them that journalists are vultures, they are just creating a crisis which does not exist. So in fact, I would say that there was fairly good coverage initially. Of course, the absolute suborning of the media. We know what's happening to the media, but despite that, we did have a little bit of coverage. But the attempt of the government to, control the narrative was so stark. I mean, not only did the Prime Minister brief senior members of the media and owners of the media in order to keep the narrative pleasant and to see support for his actions through the media, there was a definite attempt to control the media. 55 journalists had to face all kinds of problems. This is actually, these figures are not something I'm pulling out of the air. It is actually studied and put together. And these were journalists who paid for telling this story. So, I mean, you can see the importance of journalism in this moment. And that is why Harsh's report is so important for us, because at a time when, again, there is an attempt to forget these stories, forget this entire episode, and to try, and now it's all about vaccine, exceptionalism and nationalism. We forget what we did to all those people out there, and Harsh's soft, insistent voice is what I think the country should really be listening to. And that's why the book is so important, Aakar.
As a journalist,
Apart from everything else.
Did you as a journalist get a sense of the scale of the migration as it was actually unfolding? The fact that Harsh Mander says it's the largest migration on the subcontinent. This is not something that many of us,
in the world after
leaving aside the slave movement.
In hindsight, of course, but I'll tell you what, I mean, this book, for instance, layers it. I mean, the homeless and then the industrial workers, you know, it's layer by layer how people were pushed out, in the sense that they must have initially thought, let us try and manage the situation. But when things seem so desperate, you know, they were literally pushed out onto the streets. It's not that they wanted to go. A 4-hour notice, a crippling lockdown with a 4-hour notice. What do you do? And there's no public transport to, you know, there's no public transport around. How do people move? What do? They walk. They use the only form of motion that they have. That's their 2 feet. And little children, I mean, the stories of children that come out, and Harsh actually captures a lot of it, you know, because when we talk of the migrants, we always forget that, you know, at least a third of them have children traveling with them. And the helplessness, the sheer helplessness of those young lives was there for everyone to see, you know. And yes, and then it was a larger and larger tidal wave. And then we saw 2 phases, and I think that's also outlined in the book. The first phase was when people actually footed it down the highways, down any road that would take them to the places they called home. But later there was the trains that were started with so little, you know, thinking and planning, that people actually died. 80 people died on these Shramik trains. And it could have been handled so much better, you know. So you see these 2 forms of migration out. And now we know the figures are huge. So it is much larger than Partition. Partition has 12 million. I mean, here, of course, the government says 10 million, but it's much more, you know, in terms of the evidence from the ground, which is sometimes marshaled in the pages of this book.
Natasha Badhwar, you've been a colleague of Harsh Mander's for a long time. Could you describe your own experiences in this time and perhaps illustrate for us some of the lives that you came into contact with?
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions we kept asking ourselves as the days unfolded, and as we continued to go out, because of the lockdown, most of us were restricted in the neighboring areas of our own homes. For example, I'm in Noida and I couldn't cross over to Delhi for almost 3 or 4 weeks. And I began to go out into the industrial areas around my home. To have lived here for 10 years and never have known the scale of migrant labor, migrant workers who live around here, to find so many people from Jharkhand, so many young people from Jharkhand, you know, working in factories 19 onwards. And so one of that, you know, was the discovery of how it's not like we didn't know, but how blind we had been to the lives of others around us, how it took you know, this crisis for them to come out of their homes and our lives to intersect with them. There was the callousness that one had to deal with every day. You know, we were getting calls from domestic workers. We were responding to those, and we would be handing over a bag of you know, rice and atta and dal, enough for a week, to somebody, and I'd ask this woman, where do you work? And she would be able to point in a corner and say, "Wo wala flat." And you know, there's your employer. She knows you're hungry. She knows your children don't have any food at home. You're that close. to another family that on a daily basis there is so much interaction with, and complete abandonment. Somebody is coming 50, from 50 kilometers away in the same city to deliver a packet of food for them. So that level of callousness, then the articulation of the people that we were meeting, their desperation, their anger, their their understanding of their political marginalization, the understanding of people from Jharkhand that their state was looking out for them, of people from Bihar that they didn't have an app that they could, respond to. So a lot of calls were coming to us via the app that had been created by the Jharkhand government, which would put them in touch with somebody in Lucknow, who would give them the number of somebody in Delhi, who would give them the number of somebody in Noida, and we would, connect through that. Like Pamela said, children. We one of the films we edited was a young boy with a birth defect, a very articulate young boy reaching up to Harsh's knees, and he's looking at him and he's saying, मैं बड़ा होके सुपरमैन बनना चाहता हूँ, बैटमैन बनना चाहता हूँ, पुलिसमैन बनना चाहता हूँ, कुछ भी बन जाऊँ. And his mother is standing there. She has lost, she's a construction worker, and she has lost, her employer hasn't paid her, her landlord has thrown her out onto the streets. She's trying to keep some semblance of normalcy for her child, and they've suddenly lost access to medical facilities which the child needs on a daily basis. And somewhere in that mess we are trying to find, some humor, some humanity to be able to tell a story. um, uh,
You write that the state was sitting on, I think you say it is 10 crore tons of food grain.
No, no, yeah, 70 million tons, then it was
And
80. And,
it
yeah.
went up to 100 million tons,
Yeah.
which is a 10 crore tons, which is twice what is required to feed
No,
everybody in the PDU
Yeah,
system.
three or four times as much as the maximum buffer
For the whole year.
For the whole year.
Why is it that you think the state didn't unlock the silos and just send food out to the poor?
See, I keep asking this question to myself over and over again. And, I can say the problem is out there. We have a highly privatized healthcare system. We have one of the least spending on healthcare. Food was there rotting. We didn't distribute it. Uh, we had, as I said, the biggest lockdown with the smallest relief package, which in actual transfers was less than 1% of GDP. Japan did 20% of GDP, but poorer countries did a lot better than us. There can be only one answer, Aakar, and I really feel, and I want to underline this. A friend of mine read this book. I mean, many of them have responded in different ways, but this particular one said, "You're blaming Modi for everything." And I said that I'm not. I'm blaming, there's a cumulative set of policies that have resulted in, the complete abandonment, say, of the public health system. My father was an IAS officer. In my entire childhood, I remember only going to a government dispensary or hospital when I fell ill. All of that has been dismantled. It's not just happened over these last years, but the argument that was made and continues to be made, say, by Niti Aayog, that private healthcare with insurance is going to solve all our problems. 80% of trained health personnel in this country are working for the private sector. What did they do when the century's biggest health crisis hit us? They just backed off. I mean, they only made profits out of it. We were left with 20% of trained health personnel to deal with the crisis. A lot of them backed down as well. Some of them were very heroic and worked. So we built, we don't have any labor protection. If we in the middle class, actually suppose the Prime Minister had, even with our large houses, the Prime Minister had said, just stay at home and nobody will get any wages, any payment. How would we have reacted? And And this absence of solidarity, and then we were asked to celebrate and bang thalis on our balconies. You had to have a house with a balcony to bang your thalis.
I'll just take you back to the food bit. You have worked with the Supreme Court on the right to food.
Yeah, I was the Special Commission.
What is, how does the network work? What is the space between the silo and the PDS shop? And what was the difficulty in getting the grain transferred and getting it distributed?
See, we've been saying for a long time, a lot of us have been saying that you have to have a universal PDS because they, the most vulnerable.
Do we not have a universal PDS?
We don't have a universal PDS even now.
Could you just describe the system that that exists now and the disparity between the migrants and the people back home?
See, the Food Security Act did increase substantially the numbers of people covered. So to 75% in 2013 of rural families, 50% of urban families.
75% of people in rural families and 50% of people in our cities require government support to eat.
No, so this is what the law provided, but the trouble is that the requirements that you have to have an Aadhaar card, you have to have biometric verification. The most, but since my heart has always sort of forced me to reach out to the most vulnerable. They are people who will have no documents. They'll have no way of, they're not recognized and seen by the government. When Prabhat Patnaik, Jayati Ghosh and I were talking about what the government needs to do, one of the crises is that in rural areas, thanks to NREG, at least we have a listing of workers. In urban areas, actually, if the government decided, they don't even have a system of registration. Most workers are not registered. They're not recognized. I mean, if you're not going to protect them, you're not registering them. So actually, Prabhat is an economist whom I respect greatly. Finally, when we decide, how would this become operational? He said we'd actually really have to do it like the elections. Any adult person comes, you give him the food and you give him the money and you put a black mark here. The next week it will be the next finger. I mean, we've just abandoned. And Ravi Srivastav is a labor economist, and he said something that I think is really important for us. He said, 9 out of 10 workers are in the informal economy, they have no protections. Despite that, instead of increasing the protection, the government has dismantled even the little protection that existed during the lockdown. But he said much more than even this, something greater has broken, and that's what I'd like the audiences to think about. He said even more than the hunger and the joblessness, what is broken down for our laboring poor is trust. They believe that however exploited we are, when a great calamity comes, our employers and the government, probably the other way around, the government and our employers will take care of us. There was that belief that despite all the exploitation, what has really broken down is this belief. I mean, when the century's biggest health crisis hit us, what the government and the employers effectively did was to throw them to the wolves.
Do you think that had to some extent and a negative effect, this lack of trust or this breaking down of trust on what happened once the lockdown was lifted? And do the numbers that we saw, do they in some sense reflect that lack of trust? Why should I trust the state and keep social distancing when the state hasn't taken care of me?
It is, but the greatest tragedy is actually what is unfolding now. Because please remember places like rural Bihar, UP, Chhattisgarh, etc., are largely remittance economies, the countryside. And they depend on, on the income that in very exploited jobs, their young family members earn. Now, suddenly that earning collapsed. And they had to actually depend on the people whom they were supporting to give them the little money so that they could get home. And once they reached home, people said they were treated very badly along the way. They were sadly very badly treated even when they reached their villages. The fear was so huge. And if you were of a stigmatized community like the Muslims, you had much greater problems. But at the end of that, the greatest tragedy is that they have no options. Now they're returning, and they started, a point was reached initially when they were actually requisitioning flights to bring back workers. I mean, the workers were gone in this desperation. But coming back on flights, I mean, I recorded some of that from Patna, etc. First time they're getting onto a plane. They had no illusions now about what was going to happen. They said that, you know, that that we are going to be super exploited because the contractor has some target to fulfill. So we'll work 14 hours, 16 hours. We'll just sleep on the site. But one person said to me, and he said that a father cannot see his child starving. And so I have no opportunities of work here. They depended on me in whatever circumstances now, with all the trust broken, with all the terms of, without even the protections that I imagined I had.
I still need to go back.
I will have to go back.
Pamela Philipose, could you speak to what you think the lessons the government and the state have learned from this are, and if they have learned any, are these reflected in the space of the media?
Um, I would say that the cruelty of this period, which comes through in this book as well, is that it was used very, very cynically by various actors. And we know that many of our topmost corporates have said, never waste a good crisis. So people have made use of this period to actually try and remove from workers their right to an 8-hour day, something that was fought for over the years. So we are seeing a dismantling of the little bit of social welfare structures that existed. Now, whether we will see a reversal of this is the question of the future. But I think the farm agitation, for instance, indicates that there is a certain template that the government is working on, and it seems unlikely, that there are going to be a reversal of some of these cruel ways of governance. That's the only way I can express it. Just plain cruelty. Apart from the police state, apart from the use of a colonial era epidemic act, apart from all these things, the cruelty, the cruelty that marked the response of the state will remain with us, and the class-biased way in which they responded. Um, Harsh always always tries to show the comparison between the Vande Mataram, Vande Bharat flights and the Shramik train, which came in so late. I mean, the class bias choices that the government has made. And I think if the government has to learn from this, it will have to really review many of its policies. There's a budget upon us soon, and we wonder whether any of these insights will go into that budget. I have no expectation. And the media actually, I think, after that period of actually exposing what was happening on the streets, actually, sort of reverted back to type and propagated the government's narrative. So I don't think the media is going to really try and respond to all these various issues that have been highlighted in the book. And that's why this book is important, because in one place, it's putting together all that went wrong.
Quite right. I think
So that's the
more
value of the book, yeah.
were taken up from 8 to 12 in states like UP. In Bangalore, we had a member of parliament who asked the state to physically block people from leaving because that's what the builders wanted.
Exactly, yes.
Natasha Badhwar, could you speak to the idea of solidarity? We in the middle class who can work from home, who can sort of survive purely with our credit cards, with delivery services, and what we went through, and compare it to what it was that the people you met with went through. Did they have any kind of solidarity or sense of that within themselves? Did they feel spiteful? Did they feel hatred towards the rest of us who were in our flats?
One of the things really that gave a lot of hope and gave strength was witnessing solidarity, which, to be honest, came from almost every class. I mean, we had students banding together in Mumbai, in Pune, in Switzerland, and starting fundraisers and nominating Karwan-e-mohabbat as the beneficiary, and then trying to make sure we had people who run bakeries and restaurants who volunteered to use they wanted to keep their staff employed, and they wanted to somehow carry on um, uh, their, um, their places. And a lot of solidarity came from there as well. A
Before
lot
I
of
go back to Harsh, could you describe for us what Karma is and what it does and what it has done in the past?
Yeah, so the Karwan-e-mohabbat is a campaign that Harsh Mander had announced in 2017, in July, August. And I first heard of it because they were crowdfunding online and asking people to join to offer solidarity, compassion to victims of hate crimes and victims of lynch crimes. Because by 2017, by mid 2017, we had begun to see a pattern emerge where Muslim men, young and old, in different parts of the country were being what seemed like isolated incidents of being attacked by mobs, there seemed to be emerging a pattern. They were being accused of either carrying beef or, in some way hurting the cow or being a cow, taking a cow for slaughter. So we had Junaid, Akhlaq, Pehlu Khan, cases in Mangalore, Assam, etc. So the Karwan-e-mohabbat started as a campaign to highlight that these were not isolated cases, that for the first time, people who needed help after a crime had been committed did not have any solidarity from either their neighborhood or their community or the local state machinery or the government, all of whom were either too scared to speak up or were celebrating the perpetrators. And we carried on a series of journeys month after month from 2017 right up to 2019, till the anti-CAA protests erupted all over the country. And suddenly we found ourselves in a place where so many groups came together, and the Karwan-e-mohabbat almost became like a nodal point where we were coordinating with students, organizations, activists across the country to provide support to the protests and to participate in the protests in whichever way we could, which of course went into the violence in Delhi, went into the pandemic. So, it was almost like a seamless transition where we had to respond to the families that we had been working with the very new, fresh, raw victims of the Northeast Delhi violence that we were working with. And of course, I mean, the first thing that happened when the lockdown was announced was the protest sites were wiped off, the walls were whitewashed, and the rehab camps that had been set up in Northeast Delhi were completely dismantled. So
So the
we
group has
knew we
worked
had
with
to respond.
victims of hate crimes. It also worked in a solidarity with the people who were part of the CAA protests, and they also worked with the people who were victims of the lockdown. Could you tell our viewers how it is that they can get in touch with the group and contribute should they want to?
Yeah, so we have a basic website called the Karwan-e-mohabbat.in.
Karwan dash e dash
Um, Karwan-e-mohabbat.in.
So no
Karwan
dashes, and the only letter that's repeated is the B in Mohabbat.
in Mohabbat.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
And we are on the social media platforms, each one of them.
Thank you. The two things that I wanted to ask you was that we've got government data that's come out in the last couple of weeks, which suggests that the number of malnourished children in this country has gone up for the first time in several years. To what extent do you think is that the result of this specific year that we've come out of? And secondly, perhaps if you could give your reflections on the fact that the stock market is at an all-time high, the fact that companies have managed to make a lot of money out of the fact that they are no longer required to pay as much rent as they used to. People can work out of home. The middle class savings have gone up. There's not that much that they can spend on. Juxtapose it with what it is that the majority of Indians are going through.
You know, these are important and really difficult questions. The point that I want to make is there are problems with public policy, and a lot of the neoliberalism actually didn't happen with this government. It happened with the earlier government. A lot of the repressive laws like UAPA were created by the earlier government and used by the present government. It's not, I mean, when people keep addressing Modi, Modi ji, ye kiya, wo kiya, the point is that he's not a dictator who has forced himself into power. He's being elected and re-elected. Although the second time round, he had neither jobs to offer, nor an economy to offer, nor farmers' crisis resolution. He only was offering hate. And it seems that more and more of us in India, in the middle class, but sadly, the figures are that 37.6% was the vote share in 2019 that went to BJP, of which 36% was Hindu. And that every third Dalit also voted BJP. So what they have succeeded in doing is I use the metaphor of a drug that is being injected in the veins of our society. And that drug is much more deadly than any heroin or anything else. And that drug is called hate. And I think that what we are seeing is that regardless of everything you might be facing, even after hate has filled your heart and mind and soul, even hunger is acceptable. Even joblessness is acceptable. Even the biggest displacements are acceptable. And the solutions were not complicated even to start with. The countries were giving relief packages. Countries were recognizing that people will suffer if hunger and displacement. Our trains had a capacity of 23 million a day. I was calculating, I mean, the estimates now is about 30 million people, migrants. I mean, it would have required just a week of the trains running with any migrant free to walk in, and migrants could have reached their homes, and so on and so forth. These were not complicated. What troubles me is our lack of solidarity. And I don't think the problem's out there. It's with us, people of relative privilege in this country, because we have allowed and celebrated each of these policies, and we continue to do so. I mean, the fact that even after the migrant crisis became so visible, we all accepted that even the little labor protection that we have, I thought at last we would have a system of registering workers, ensuring them basic social security, things that we've been talking about for a long time. The privatization of healthcare, even countries like Spain had a privatized healthcare system, but they said that now when this century biggest crisis is there, they nationalized their private healthcare system. I see them even now, even in the vaccine pricing, even the pricing of testing. Everybody is more worried about the profits of this private sector than reaching the poorest. And on the one hand, just responding, I don't see a bleak picture, because I was amazed and moved every time I was on the streets by ordinary Indians of the middle class and the poor who used to come out. I mean, used to find, I mean, when the migrants were walking, I remember standing for several hours, lines of cars were coming, packed with cooked food and water packets, which people would hand out to migrants and then would drive away. Unknown people. I mean, there's that reality too. I remember this, I'll never forget this homeless man I met outside in Zamni. He was a single homeless man. I asked him, how are you managing? he said, I had a little bit of saving, and so I've been buying it for food, but that is over. And then he told me that not just food for myself, I'm alone, but this family that sleeps next to me has two small children. How could I eat if those two children slept hungry? So I used to provide food for everybody. There were acts of solidarity that were extraordinary, but they were too little, and we cannot survive. We cannot hope that the poor survive on the expectation of charity from, chance charity from middle class people. That is not a dignified way of living. We have to recognize, what we've been talking about, universal social rights, that have your business, whatever is happening, but let there be a floor of dignity below which no one can fall. No child will sleep hungry, no child will die because they can't afford healthcare. Everyone will have some basic social housing, they'll have running clean water. The old people will have pensions, and we've calculated it would cost about 10% of the GDP. Our tax to GDP ratio today is around 14%. Even America has something like 24%. It's not that we don't have the money. It's just that the lives of the poor have not mattered to us, and despite this greatest humanitarian crisis that we are seeing, which I think is going to unfold in much worse forms in the coming months. You have to read The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck to see what happened in the Great Depression to the poor.
Could you reflect on what you see happening going forward, given the fact that in the last 12 months, we've seen two very large movements from the bottom up, and one mass migration, and all of that has come with
that was a movement as well.
It was also a movement indeed. So do you feel that just like in the 20s of the United States that he documented, there will be some big change in the offering in terms of public policy and the way that money in this country is taxed and spent?
It's not going to happen quickly. I think it's going to happen over a generation, because I think to get here was 100 years, the Hindu Mahasabha, the RSS, a certain kind of politics, the Muslim League. See, what are the principal projects of this government? One is a project of hate. The second is a project to crush all voices of dissent. And the third, which I think is not stated enough, is to hand over all public resources to a few big public houses. So BSNL were functioning great. Now they're all dismantled and we have only Jio. These are not things that are happening by chance. Now, to this project, my only hope is that every second Indian is below the age of 25. The country that we were given by the people in the freedom struggle, your generation and mine, we've messed it up really badly. And it is for these young people who I see, they ask me what is the solution. To my mind, the solution is actually, when they say Modi Murdabad, I say I don't agree with that. Let Modi live and live well. That's not the problem. The problem is with us. Can we as a society believe that every life has equal value? Until we do that, it's a civilizational crisis that we are dealing with. Modi is only representing the collective aspirations of people of relative privilege and power in this country. And he's understood us very well. And he's more and more, he was distributing, getting photographed in fancy clothes, giving food to peacocks at the height of the hunger crisis in this country. There's something that we need to recognize. And again, it's not about him, it's about us. It's about, I've said this in the book, and when the migrants were walking, they organized buses for the students in Kota. I'm delighted that they did. But I was waiting, one child, one student among them could have said, I refuse to get onto this bus and go home unless you provide the same facilities to all the migrants who are on the streets, who are walking the streets. That solidarity to my mind, something that we'll have to build over a generation. Where, what Natasha was describing. I mean, your domestic help is actually begging for food within your eyesight. It's not that you can't afford it. Each of those packets cost us about 1,000 rupees. It's not that we could not have afforded to give it. Their lives didn't matter to us.
Okay, we'll take questions from the audience. The book is about 200 pages long, Locking Down the Poor. I would highly recommend it. I think it gives a good sense, and it's very racy to read. I'll just add one thing to what it is that was said, which is that when the head of the Niti Aayog spoke last month, he said something about too much democracy, which got picked up by the media. What was not noticed as much, I think, was a statement he made saying that this government was doing something that no government before it had the courage to do, which is that pick 5 companies and make them global champions. I think a lot of what we are seeing in this country today in terms of how it is unfolding can be seen through that lens, going back to 2016 and November. Questions from the audience?
We've got a couple of questions online, and if you've got a question, you could either ask it from where you are, or you're welcome to come over here and ask the question. Yeah, please do come over here, then it's a little more audible for everyone. And please do introduce yourself before asking the question and keep it short, please.
Thank you. My name is Ram. It's an unfortunate event which happened, and there's a lot of anger which is outside. I thought it would come out in the form of either election results or some other thing. I'm still anxious as to how it's going to unfold. I would like your views on that, because a migration like this, a sad event like this, cannot be suppressed. There is something which is lying there which we are not able to fathom.
I think there's too little anger. I think that our Indian laboring poor has accepted for too long the kind of oppressive, what we're asking for is fundamental. I was reading the report of the colonial government in 1894 or something, after the Bombay plague. And what they said was, it's extraordinary. It said there are only 2 things that can prevent and protect the poor from future calamities of this kind. One of them is clean air, the other is clean water. And we have to build this city to ensure that everybody has access. And this was in 1894. We chose places like Dhadri are the densest populations in the entire planet. We've not allowed a system of social security to build up. We've not allowed any kind of labor protection to happen. We spend just about 1% of our GDP on healthcare. We should be spending about 3%. We floated the myth that these big companies, big for-profit, are going to solve all our problems. We don't have a common school system. So I think that the poor have accepted all of this, and now they're going to even accept the fact that we can't even trust them to help us in the biggest calamities. And they don't have options. A lot of people have asked, why did people not rebel? Anywhere else in the world, you'd have seen violence, you'd have seen anger, public anger. We didn't see it. People just have suffered through it. Time magazine carried a story, actually, a cover story on the migrants. And it was a beautifully written essay, because it followed one Hindu migrant and all the travels he faced. And at the end of that whole, 3-4 pages, he asked him, who will you vote for in the next election? He said, Modi ji. And then he asked me, he had a long interview with me, and he said that, how can you explain this? And it's exactly the question that you are asking. And to my mind, I gave the reply that it is simply that we've been intoxicated with this drug that is on offer, which is called hate. And once we are intoxicated with this drug, everything is acceptable, including joblessness, including hunger, including the greatest suffering. And I think that until we rebuild solidarities, we fight together. I mean, what is great about both Shaheen Bagh and the farmers' crisis, I, I would, for generations, we should remember how the Sikh farmers came to Shaheen Bagh and they said, we've seen one partition in 47, we will not allow it to happen. That's why we've come to ensure that our sisters in Shaheen Bagh get langar and that also of desi ghee. And one person sells his house because they didn't have enough money. He is being charged under UAP, etc., with the same kind of cases like us. And when the farmers' crisis starts, Malerkotla, which is the one Muslim area that was left in, their youth went and started langars for the Sikh farmers. These expressions of solidarity across religion, across class, across caste, I think that is the only thing that can save us, because that is the alternative to the imagination of the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha of what kind of country we should have.
Some people might not know the scale of what the migration was purely by the numbers. You write that in Surat, for instance, about half of the population came from outside the city.
57% of Surat's population is migrant workers.
It's like a Gulf country.
I'll take a question from someone online. Deepti Patel asks, do you think the COVID crisis has brought the vulnerable to the realization that they deserve better from not only the state, but civil society as well? And how do you think they will act upon this? And related to that, how do you think India can nurture moral courage within the political sphere and within society at large?
Great questions. I keep struggling about why the poor accept, such a subhuman life without protest. There was a correspondent from the New York Times who, I think, a few years ago asked me to walk with her at night to understand the conditions of the homeless. And when we were walking, she remarked, she said, I would have not been able to do this in New York. I'd have been afraid of being mugged. I'd have been afraid of violence. And here you're walking comfortably with me. And I suddenly realized that the homeless people are actually so compliant. You never fear from them, although they have nothing. So is the question cultural? Is the question something? To my mind, it is really that they have learned, because of the caste system, they've learned to accept a position where we will be oppressed. And as long as we can survive somehow, that's the best we can expect from people in our observation.
If there's any other folks in the audience that have a question, please do come up here. Otherwise, I'll continue with the online questions. There's another question from Isha Garg, and she asks, do you think India could ever have universal basic income, universal basic health, and universal basic education in our governance charter?
Universal basic income is something that I don't support, but universal social rights, certainly. Health for all, education for all, housing for all, clean water, etc. Again, going back to Prabhat Patnaik, he's calculated, he said, in fact, it's very interesting, he said the struggle for universal social rights is the new class struggle for our times. And that it will cost at the most 10% of GDP. It's not as if we cannot afford these resources. 5 lakh crores was what was written off in budget after budget in Mr. Chidaman's time and subsequently. Now they've stopped, writing that line, which is tax holidays for the super rich. All of this, it's not as if we don't have the money, we don't have the resources. They say that a 1.5% tax on the wealth of dollar billionaires is more than enough to send every child to school, to do all of this. We will not get there until all of us believe that every child deserves. How many of us are willing for a common school system? I've talked to so many people and I think what is the real fear is that, imagine a school where my child My domestic health child and a street child will actually study in the same classroom. Maybe they'll sit on the same bench. Maybe they'll become friends. Maybe they'll eat together. And most frightening of all, maybe my domestic health child will turn out brighter than mine. We are not ready for it.
Just to clarify, you're not in favor of a universal basic income, but you do support a targeted income.
No, I say no. I mean I say protection of wages, etc. Universal labor rights, universal. The idea of a universal basic income is it's complicated. It's another debate. Uh, it's sort of it's seen as a substitute for food, for healthcare, and for a lot of other things. It will be inflationary.
Right.
Men take decisions about cash. Women take decisions culturally about food that is transferred, etc. So those are the problems.
Thanks. Do the two of you have any remarks at the end? Pamela, Philipose, first you.
Um, I I don't know whether this is the time to come in, but I do feel that this pandemic has really thrown the light on many major uh, issues of the day, some of which are talked about in the book. One, of course, is education of children. And we are on the point of losing a generation of learning because we know that our kids don't have access to school. Your virtual classrooms reach a very few. Not many can subscribe to YJU classes. For heaven's sake, I think we need to understand that we need to bring our children back into the classroom. Otherwise, we will be left with a generation of people who have not had even the basic access to basic education. The second, of course, is women's employment, which was again starkly brought into view, and women and violence against women in situations of the home. These are issues that came up and emerged during this period. And the third, of course, is understanding the migrant today. And we have been told, I mean, corporate India has wanted to actually move bodies from rural India into urban India. But what do we do with those bodies? How do we understand them? And actually, there's so many different kinds of migrants. And that is what also comes through here in Harsh's account, in the sense there's circular migrants. There are so many different kinds of migrants. And how do we understand the role they're playing in the GDP of this country? We have said women's labor is lost to the GDP of the country, but so also migrant workers' labor. It's not properly accounted for. And I think we need to, sort of train our sights on these major issues. And the pandemic has given us an opportunity to do that, if we are to see it in a positive way.
Natasha, Badhwar.
I think it's it's been it's been a year in which there has been a political as well as a personal crisis in the lives of most of us, and I mean, for me, it's interesting to see how the two crises actually merge. You know, every time I sit down as a writer to start a new piece, I need to re-evaluate what is relevant, what matters. Do you go on talking about the collapse of, uh, the moral, political, the collapse of governance as we knew it? Or do we give ourselves some space in which to recover our own voice? I mean, how do we deal with all of these things that are making us feel simultaneously very, very unimportant and helpless, and yet, giving telling us that this is the time to act, to find your voice at exactly the time when you feel that, and I particularly feel that I've lost my voice, that I just can't write or speak or express in the way that I could till 2019. Suddenly 2020 has shaken way too much. And in the midst of that, to see this book emerge, to see how strong Harsh has managed to keep his voice, for him to come back from COVID, as well as all the complications that he suffered, in hospital over it, and be sitting here talking about, everything that happened in his life as well pre-COVID. It's so the inspiration is coming at the same time, the despair is coming at the same time, and it's really, I think, a time when we are almost kind of pressing the restart button in many of our own personal lives. And I hope that we'll all be collectively be able to go in the right direction.
Get a chance to speak about Harsh Mander's COVID experience next time. So I'm told that the movie is ready. Here we go.
घर में रहने से हम लोगों का काम काज तो है नहीं, हमें कहते घर में रहिए, हम क्या घर में रह के दीवारें तोड़ के खाएंगे।
When students were stranded in Kota and the government organized those beautiful buses and took them home, I keep thinking, I wish I lived in a country where maybe one student would say, I refuse to get onto this bus. I refuse to be taken home in this way until you do the same for my place. But we didn't have one student who did that.
नहीं तो पैदल ही जाएंगे फिर घर। पैसे नहीं।
The book is called Locking Down the Poor. Highly recommended. I'd like to thank all three of our guests, Pamela Philipose, Natasha Badhwar, and Harsh Mander. I'd also like to thank BIC.
And thank you very much, Aakar, and of course, thank you, Harsh.
Thank you to our audience for making the time to
And
come.
thank you, Natasha, and thank you, Pamela, as well. Lots to think about for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you.